What if you didn't know the true identity of America's most deadly killer? Because officially, it's a man named Samuel Little, and his count of 93 victims is almost 3 times that of notorious serial killers like Ted Bundy, Gary Ridgway, and John Wayne Gacy. But what I don't get when it comes to the history books is why the real name of America's deadliest ever killer doesn't seem to appear. Because I would say that 918 people, including over 300 children, all passed away after being murdered by Jim Jones. And if you've ever heard the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid, you're about to hear the dark and disturbing truth about where that phrase comes from. In today's podcast, you're going to hear about one of the most fascinating cases in not just true crime, but modern history. How does a man captivate and brainwash thousands of people, each and every one willing to sign their life away and give over every penny to their name just for a chance to join his paradise? But what happens when that paradise is not a reality, and when the dream that you were sold turns into a nightmare? Forced to work hard labor, held captive without food, and medical care denied, which would lead to multiple deaths, and at the end of it all, the most deadly massacre in modern American history. This is the story of Jonestown.
In this video, we're going to talk about one of the biggest loss of American citizens' life in one day in history. And the nature of these passings is so shocking, so devastatingly evil, and so distressing that we have to warn you before going into this episode. And remember, if you're struggling with anything right now, we will leave resources in the description of this video. Just know that you're never alone, and there will be stuff in the description that can help. Now, let me start off with setting the scene of this horrific case. The story starts with a backdrop of racism, the civil rights movement, and the Red Scare. And that's because in the 1950s onwards, the USA is changing fast. In 1954, the US Supreme Court ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional, and violence against African Americans was rife. And in 1955, a 14-year-old boy called Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi in gruesome fashion. By 1963, hundreds of thousands of people gather in the nation's capital demanding freedom and equality, with Martin Luther King Jr. giving his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was written into law. This law banned segregation in public places and employment discrimination, and yet, in reality, discrimination is still pervasive in US society. By 1965, Bloody Sunday happened, which was where peaceful marchers in Selma, Alabama were beaten and gassed on live television. The outrage forces through the Voting Rights Act to protect black voting rights. By 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was shot dead in Memphis, and riots erupt in more than 125 US cities. What is absolutely clear is that there was no equality in America, with millions of people in all corners of the country struggling in their day-to-day lives. And it wasn't just that. In the era of the Cold War, there was also conflicts that were so-called hot wars, because yes, the Americans were toing and froing with the Russians, and the nuclear threat was intense. But also, there was incredible threat in Vietnam and a huge failure during that campaign. And as a result, trust in the government was incredibly low, and people were looking for a better life and perhaps a simpler life too. And that is where we meet an unassuming young man called Jim Jones.
So Jim Jones was born on the 13th of May 1931 in Indiana. Jim's father, James Sr., was a soldier in World War I, but he actually had complications after he was gassed in battle, and it meant that after he returned from the war, his life was never the same. He said he had long-term health issues that stopped him from being able to work, and that meant that it was Jim Jones's mother, Lynette, who was the family's sole provider. She worked at a factory, and her single modest wage had to clothe and feed the family. And it's a little bit of a sensitive subject with Jim's father, because although he was in effect a war hero and he had served for his country, there is a bit of debate when it comes to whether or not he could have worked. And if the allegations about him were true, then perhaps he could have, because apparently James Jones Sr. was well enough to frequently beat his son, but not to do a day's work. And Jim Jones didn't speak well of his father. He described him as an avid racist, someone who apparently wouldn't let Jim bring certain school friends back to the house because of the colour of their skin. Jones also recalled one time that he was said to have brought a stray dog home and his father beat him for that. Although it is very important to understand that when we're talking about Jim Jones, there's the way that he describes things, and then there's the reality. In effect, everything that we've just told you about James Jones Sr. could be a lie, but that was how Jim Jones described his father, and strange is how other people describe Jim Jones. And to be honest, he was more interested in reading than playing, often spending times with his head in books about Hitler, Joseph Stalin and others. And it's said that Jones developed an obsession with religion and death from a very young age.
Right, we know that you are planning a trip this year and we are about to save you a huge amount of cash. And that's because the one thing that costs so much money when you're away is random roaming fees while using your phone when you're in a different country. But you can avoid all of that by using our favorite eSIM of all time, and that is Saily. Because Saily is an app that gives you instant mobile data in over 200 destinations worldwide without those ridiculous roaming charges. No physical SIM cards, no queuing at airport kiosks, and no dodgy vending machines when you land, just to get your hands on a SIM. So here's how it works. Just download the Saily app first, then you can pick your country. Let's say it's the United States. Then you choose how much data you need and for how long. Then you only ever have to install the SIM once. And the best part is when you land, your eSIM will automatically start working. So it's as simple as that. And what that means is that you're online straight away. Your Maps is working, your Uber is booked, and you can start checking Instagram to see what your mates are up to. And when we've been abroad, we've found that Saily eSIMs are actually even quicker than hotel Wi-Fi. So it saves us a load of time, and it means that we can catch up with people back home. Plus, there is inbuilt ad blocking as part of the service, and you get 24-hour support. So if you've got any issues, you can contact them and get an answer. And if your phone isn't compatible, Saily will give you a full refund. So before you go on your next trip, make sure you download Saily. You can do so using the link in the description. And if you use code Joey and Josh, you will get 15% off your first order. Remember, the link is saily.com/Joey and Josh, and make sure you use that to get sorted before you travel. Now let's get back into the video.
So people that knew Jim Jones said that as a kid, he would throw like elaborate funerals for pets of his that had died, right? The problem was he didn't even have that many pets, and these funerals were becoming very fucking frequent, which obviously led people to believe that he could have been killing these pets to throw the funerals for.
It's a bit of a typical serial killer trope, isn't it, when you're bringing home killing pets?
It does sound familiar. We've heard it a few times. School friends said that he would walk the corridors with a Bible perched underneath his arms. And they even said that although he wasn't considered a popular member of his class at school, there was once a pep rally where the school were playing a rival school, and Jones got in front of a crowd and completely captivated them, staging a mock funeral for the other school.
Is that where he discovers that he's actually pretty good at public speaking?
It can't have hurt. I mean, to be able to orchestrate a crowd like that, especially a young high school crowd where attention spans are like that, it would have shown him that he had somewhat of a talent there. And when he was at high school, he started volunteering at the Reed Memorial Hospital. This is where he met a nursing student called Marceline Baldwin. She was also from Indiana and grew up in a religious household. And she was impressed by Jim when she met him. She felt that he took his work seriously and genuinely cared, which was way more than you could say for a lot of the other young lads that were working at the hospital around that time. However, their relationship was almost on the rocks before it had even started. Did you know about this?
No.
So Marceline came from a massively religious family, and that meant that her father, Walter Baldwin, Marceline's dad, was an incredibly religious man. He was of the Quaker faith, and he straight away was said to have kind of sussed Jim Jones out. He felt that Jim Jones was overconfident and brash for a young man meeting his new partner's parents that first time. But in probably the first real bit of manipulation that we'll see from Jim Jones, he manages to convince Walter and the family that he too is from the Quaker faith. And what first started off as a lie to gain the support and trust of his partner's family did seem to blossom into something more. There's a lot of debate over whether Jim Jones was a Quaker, whether he was even religious in the slightest, but there's one thing for sure, and that was that Jim Jones did give a lot of his time to religion. It was around this time that he started preaching on corners in Richmond, Louisiana, and his preaching style was captivating because many people had never heard a man speak like he did. He had no prejudice. He was an advocate for racial equality, civil rights, and social ideals. And the fact that Louisiana was still pretty racially segregated around this time meant that it would have been a warm welcome for many to hear a white man fighting for the corners of society's minority groups. And that meant that, unlike many people before him, Jim Jones was able to captivate different groups of people with his preaching. At this time, Jones was one of very few people who shared his beliefs, and he was one of even fewer that would vocalize those beliefs. In 1952, Jones served as a student pastor at the Somerset Southside Methodist Church, and he was actually let go from this role due to the fact that he was going against the church's protocol and he was allowing African Americans into the church. And although those circumstances may sound ridiculous in 2026, this was a very different time. And what Jim Jones did in this moment would set off a chain reaction like no other in history. Because instead of taking the advice of the church and stopping African Americans from coming in, Jim Jones left and he started his own independent ministry in a rented space. This organization started off by the name of the Community Unity Church, but within a year it was called the People's Temple. And within that year it had moved to a bigger and permanent location. The temple was growing fast, with some reports claiming that it gained over 900 members within its first year. So how is it that Jim Jones was able to captivate, gain the trust and dedication of these members? Well, on the eye, that's because Jim Jones was offering something that no one else was, and that was complete and utter equality. So as well as spreading the message of religion, Jim Jones was campaigning for equality within the workplace. And that meant as well as spreading the message of religion, Jim Jones was campaigning for racial equality within the workplace. At the time, the black community were either not allowed or were frowned upon by going into churches at the same time as white church-going members. This was something that Jim Jones would not stand for. And those beliefs opened Jim Jones and the People's Temple up to so many more like-minded and open-minded people. He opened food kitchens and soup banks. He helped the homeless with money and seeking employment. And maybe most audaciously, he performed miracles. Kind of.
What the hell do you mean, kind of miracles?
We're sort of talking David Blaine Dynamo style things, but without any of the skill.
So no toothpaste involved in these ones?
There wasn't toothpaste, but there was a lot of stuff involved that maybe shouldn't have been, including animal intestines. Basically, what Jim Jones used to do is he would get a crowd and he would get someone that was in on the scam up from the crowd. So say, for example, he would get someone that was pretending to be in a wheelchair and he would rub his hands on that person's legs and miraculously they would stand. He would get people that claimed to have tumours and cancers, and what he would do is get animal kidneys and guts and stuff like that. He would pretend to reach into their body and to pull the tumour or the cancer out, but in fact it would just be animal guts at that time. What he would also do is use his surveillance teams to be able to work out things about the members' families and about their pasts that maybe weren't in the public domain at that time. And then Jim Jones would act as a psychic who was speaking to people from the past or back home. Basically, all of this was part of a huge mass manipulation. And most worryingly of all, he even produced resuscitations on certain members who he said he was bringing back. back. Now, actually, what had happened is Jim Jones had forced substances on those members until they were incapacitated or passed out. And as those substances wore off and came out of those members' systems, Jim Jones would pretend he had revived them.
What I've never really been able to get my head around is why people actually bought this. Like, it was quite clearly for us now, looking back, a grift. But what was it about what Jim Jones actually did that made it so convincing to everyone out there?
I think he was one of the first of his time, and definitely probably the first person that had the guts to speak about these things. And I would also argue that, although you could probably look and find me examples, one of the first people that I'm conscious of really targeting minority groups a way of self-gain, in my opinion. So I personally believe that he was a master manipulator.
Yeah.
And I believe that he targeted certain groups that he felt maybe needed sticking up for, maybe needed help.
And this is the
society.
thing, isn't it? Because like, he targeted minorities all over the country. And what he was really, really good at was using that groundswell of a changing society, and he maximized that for his own personal benefit. So when he's going and performing these miracles, what he was doing was actually conning these people, and it would take an incredible amount of practice and time and people being in on the cons to actually make sure that people did believe it. And again, you've got to remember as well, this wasn't something that just happened once. Like, this was happening over and over and over again, and he was making people buy it. It's often called the long con. That's what people have described it as. And I feel like he hit this thing perfectly at the time. And he used the sentiment that he was helping people and sort of putting an arm around as many groups as he possibly could to maximize the impact of these miracles.
Yeah, and I also think that in 2026, maybe religion isn't as prominent in some parts of America as it previously was in these times. And therefore, there was always going to be an element of people that were looking for something to follow, looking for something to find peace and happiness in.
I'm really glad you said that as well, right? Because I think the religious element of this is so fascinating. Because Jim Jones was born in a religious household. He very much started his career as being a religious man. But the thing is that slowly started to change. And sentiment very quickly changed to not just a religious movement, but also a cultural and political movement. And that started really because in the 1950s and 60s, there was a huge worry about the threat of nuclear weapons. Russia was engaged in direct conflict, not just the Cold War, which often people think, but other theatres of war with the United States. And so there was a very real threat that the United States may have been nuked. So as a result, many Americans built their fallout shelters. They started gathering supplies, and many of them started praying that they wouldn't actually be hurt. And in 1961, Jim Jones has what he describes as a revelation from God. He says that he was given a vision where he saw a nuclear blast going off right in front of him. And as a result of that, he started to look for other locations to take what he described as the People's Temple. And by January 1962, Jim Jones was reading a few magazines. He comes across Esquire magazine and he reads an article called 9 Places to Hide. This article was all about different locations you could live in the world and basically where you could escape the nuclear apocalypse. One of those locations ended up being a place in Argentina called Belo Horizonte. And in early 1962, he moves his family there and conducts what he describes as a scouting mission to see if he could bring the entire People's Temple Church with him. What he did was rent a small house with his family, and he tried to continue his life of preaching and social outreach. But after struggling to find work and not being able to speak the local language, the move starts to feel like a complete failure. So in 1963, he actually moves to a different part of Argentina, this time to Rio de Janeiro, one of the biggest cities in the country. And again, he wasn't able to make enough money. He wasn't able to coalesce people in the same way that he did in the United States. So by the end of that year, 1963, he goes back home to America. So with his tail between his legs, Jones needed to concoct a plan. He started prophesying and going through various sermons, telling his followers in the people's temples that nuclear annihilation was real and it was coming very, very soon. The intensity of his sermons ramped up and he started rambling and going off into various different hours-long sermons speaking to the people of People's Temple. And because he read this article and because he was looking at different places to locate the congregation, he knew that he could isolate the families and potentially get more control over the people that were in the church. But going back to the church in Indianapolis, because he'd left it for pretty much 18 months at this time, it was smaller, it was more divided, and in fact, it was worse off financially as well than the time in which he left. It got so bad, in fact, that he actually had to sell the original church building and move the congregation to a smaller location that he was renting. So he starts looking for other locations, and all during this time, he starts saying that this movement isn't just religious and spiritual. There's something far more important than that. It's political, it's cultural, it's a way of saving a society, and it's a way of creating something which is utopic, something which is beautiful, something which America and its capitalist regime, its way of exploiting people, just cannot provide. This is where he finds a place in California, and it's called Redwood Valley. Ironically enough, it was also in that Esquire article. And after rousing speeches to his congregation claiming that both God and the scientific world had convinced him that California was one of the safest places to hide out during a devastating war, Jones manages to convince 140 people in 1965 to give up their jobs, to sell their homes, leave their friends and family, and to follow him to California. He buys over 60 acres of land, and after finding some temporary places at first, by 1968 he built their own church complex, and he calls it Happy Acres. You can imagine just how much cash this venture needed to function, and the one thing that Jim Jones was very good at was getting people to part with their hard-earned money. He sold them that dream of the socialist utopia, and he had his followers donate funds from their house sales and regularly requested cash via his sermons. He even lied about how much cash was actually coming in to basically brainwash and guilt trip people into giving more and more money. So bad it actually got that people were giving up pretty much their entire life savings just to keep the church, what he described as afloat. And because he was raking in so much money, he started making some serious investments, which included setting up a brand new headquarters in San Francisco in 1970. By 1972, they actually bought a brand new building for $122,000, which you can only imagine how expensive that would be in modern day money 50 years later. And while his congregation laid their heads at night in sleeping bags, this man was raking in serious cash, investing in that multi-story building and getting serious power with various different politicians all around the general location.
Do you know how much at the height Jim Jones and Jonestown in general was bringing in per month?
I don't know. I'd love to know. Go on.
It was an estimated $65,000 per month.
Absolutely crazy money. And again, this is, you have to put it into context. That is completely different level to the amount of money that it would be $65,000 in these days. And it is a huge amount of cash.
And do you know one of the main reasons of how he would acquire that money?
Go on.
So basically, when members would sign up, they at first were forced to sign over 25% of their assets, right? But obviously, as things came on and as things came along in Jonestown, it got more powerful, it got bigger. It got to the point where they were signing over more like 99% of their assets, of their life, of any welfare that came in, any social welfare checks, anything like that, any inheritance, any salary whatsoever was going to Jim Jones.
Yeah, and get this. Basically, Jim Jones started this community and he said that he was feeding people, he was paying for medical bills. And at the time, he was actually doing some of those things. But every time he got a new follower into the compound, he was getting money and welfare checks from the United States. So much of that money was kept to him that he was actually giving people canned food. He was living, and they were living incredibly modest lifestyles, while Jim Jones was living a life of, you know, frivolity. He was doing anything that he wanted. He was buying expensive clothes. He was buying property. He was spending so much money on himself, and he was not living in the way that he was forcing all of the members of his church. And what I mean by that is, well, he was sexually promiscuous, he was taking mistresses, he was also listening to various music, he was drinking, he was taking substances. And by the way, all of these things were directly in sermons telling his followers that they weren't allowed to do. And Jones knew that gaining new members was key to his income generation, but also to gain more power that he saw over the decision makers around him. So he started organizing buses, and at the peak in early 1970s, there was around 10 to 15 Greyhound buses, and they were packed with members of People's Temple, and their role was to go and find new communities and acquire new converts. Sometimes these people would be away from their families for weeks on end, and they wouldn't have any contact with them. And in fact, a lot of the families were seriously worried about these people, and they didn't even get paid for this work. One of those missions actually went to Los Angeles, and Jones wanted to find more and more people from this city because he knew it was fertile ground for his kind of work. So he buys another church building in LA, and this location very quickly acquired more and more members, mainly because there were awful attacks on minorities in the 1960s in Los Angeles. And so people in the city wanted a better life, and more than anything, they just wanted change. So with this influx of new members, Jones's power significantly increased. And we saw this at a political level because Jones directly implicated and assisted the political campaigns of Mayor George Moscone and Governor Jerry Brown, mainly by getting people to actually vote for them, but he also helped campaign and raise awareness of their political careers. And in 1975, Jim was actually voted one of the most influential clergymen in the entire United States. And in 1976, he was given the Los Angeles Humanitarian of the Year award, even though during this entire time, he wasn't looking after the people of his church. He didn't care about them, and he was often making them live in quite horrible conditions. And what we're saying here is that Jones was very much in the ear and had these swathes of power from some very serious people. Moscone even rewarded Jones with the honorary title of chairman of the housing authority, even though Jones wasn't looking after the people that were part of his congregation. But Joey, it wasn't all rosy for Jonesy. The People's Temple was starting to attract some rather negative attention, mainly because there were people starting to leave. And when these defectors did leave, they started talking, and not in the ways that Jim Jones wanted. And when they did, they said that they were being exploited. They said that they were being beaten. And they were even telling stories about the healing and how unbelievable they actually were. As a result, journalists started looking into the People's Temple, and there was a group called the Gang of Eight. They wrote a letter to Jones, calling him out on his hypocrisy around sex and their private life. And it came out that Jones actually had a homosexual encounter with a prospective church member, even though he preached that this activity was immoral. They also alleged that People's Temple was indeed racist. And while Jones was out there preaching equality, in reality, senior leaders of the church were all white. And they even started talking at this time about so-called punishments. Now, so far, we haven't actually even spoken about these punishments yet, but they were so significant and so important to the role of Jim Jones at this time that we've got to speak about them. Basically, what was going on is if there was anyone acting out, if there was anyone talking about defecting, if there was anyone talking about leaving the church, in fact, if there was any improper behavior that Jones saw at all, they would get physical violence. This started off with whippings, but it also then led on to beatings. There was even a thing called the Board of Education, which was basically a piece of wood, and it was used to physically assault members of the church. Very often, family members, parents, had to do that to their own kids. If they didn't do it what Jim Jones described as properly, they would be beaten even worse. And people lived in fear of the physical violence of Jim Jones. So the People's Temple was far from what Jones described it being. And after this letter, Jones's paranoia was building in intensity. What he decided was that he needed an escape plan, a way to control his followers even more, and to keep them away from the prying eyes of the American media and authorities. And he had a right to be worried because, to be fair, the American authorities were starting to cotton on to what Jim Jones was actually doing. So Jones started looking for different locations. He remembered traveling through Guyana, a small country, on the way to Belo Horizonte. And by early 1973, he was looking hard at that place. In December of that year was the first visit. He met with officials of the country and scattered remote land near the Venezuelan border. By mid-1974, he secured a long-term lease on a huge area of rainforest, about 4,000 acres in all, and he started buying heavy equipment, building materials, food, and medical supplies. Then he sent 15 temple members. Together, they were called the Founders. And what they started doing was physical, back-breaking work to make this area of rainforest livable, because what Jim Jones's plan was to relocate his entire flock, his entire congregation, and send them to Guyana and a new place, a new town that he called Jonestown. The first year was back-breaking, intense work for the Founders. They had to clear dense jungle by hand with limited machinery. They had to cut roads and paths into the site. They had to build dormitories, kitchens, latrines, and a pavilion. And they even had to install a generator and basic water systems. They started planting crops as well, and slowly over time, the community was actually able to feed itself. And in those first few years, the community grew very slowly. All in all, there were about 40 or 50 people in a couple of years. And despite working from early sunup to sundown, a lot of the people that lived in Jonestown during this period actually described the place as being idyllic. Jim Jones didn't very often go to this place, and so they had relatively normal lives. They were able to eat really well. They had dinners of meat and soup, and they had puddings that were really tasty, and they basically enjoyed every moment, even though they were doing back-breaking work. The place, Jonestown, without Jim Jones, felt idyllic. Some people might even describe it as a paradise.
And there definitely was trouble in paradise, starting off with the stories that came out of when members tried to leave. It was said that Jonestown was specifically hostile towards anyone who was seen to be deserting, in their opinion. And that meant that a lot of people were told they couldn't leave. Some people that tried to defect were actually forced into signing admissions of guilt for crimes that they hadn't committed so that they could use it as blackmail against the members. Jim Jones knew that power lied in numbers, and if his numbers dwelled, then he would not be as powerful. And there were stories that came out that involved people that tried to leave apparently being injected with substances. Jim Jones would have speakers playing throughout the day with constant propaganda about America and how they were under attack. And a catalyst that drove one member out of Jonestown were the White Nights. The White Nights were basically evenings where Jim Jones would round up the whole colony and he would stage an emergency, a panic, as if they were under siege from the American government. He would tell them all sorts of horror stories, and eventually he would even start to have them believe that their shelter was being attacked. Jim Jones had got enforcers to stand around the jungle and to fire shots inside, to throw things, and to have those inside Jonestown believe that their time was about to run out. And when they fully believed that, that's when Jim Jones would execute his plan on the White Nights. He used the White Nights, in my opinion, as a means to test the waters, as a means to see just how much the members trust him and just how far they would go at his say-so. Just as those inside felt like the attack was about to commence, Jim Jones encouraged everyone to take what he told them was poison. Those who accepted the poison would in the aftermath be honoured by the Jonestown members, and those who didn't would be ridiculed. And that was because the poison was not, in fact, poison. But for Jones, this substance, whatever it was, gave him the power that he believed he needed. One person who witnessed the White Nights and was very much disgusted at it was Deborah Layton. She lived in Jonestown with both her brother and her terminally ill mother. And she actually worked as the Jonestown financial secretary, which meant that she had more access to Jim Jones than others. She felt that Jonestown was filthy, ravaged with diseases, and those who didn't catch infections were ill due to lack of food. Apparently, most members were living on a diet of rice and beans, and that's why in May 1978, Deborah finally took her chance when she got here. She was tasked with chaperoning a group to the Guyanese capital, Georgetown, and when she arrived, she used the opportunity to secretly contact her sister and to expose the Jonestown camp. Her sister told her to go to the US Embassy and wait while she sorted her a plane ticket, and that's what Deborah did. She jumped on that plane, and the second she got home, she went about recording an affidavit to take down Jonestown. And of course, this would become front page news because Deborah was telling everyone the truth and just what a dangerous place Jonestown had come to be. However, not all of Deborah's family shared the same views as her, and this included her brother Larry Layton. He condemned his sister after defecting and even wrote letters to the US government in which he claimed that she was lying. Deborah's mother didn't even know that she had left, and she actually died shortly after. The next person we have to speak about is Yolanda Williams. She traveled to Jonestown as a college student with her husband and their young child, believing they were moving to a socialist paradise. But just 3 months into her stay, she realizes that Jonestown is far from how it was described. Instead of being a tropical paradise, she describes it as more like a concentration camp. And she also understood that Jim Jones did not want people to leave, and therefore she waited until the perfect opportunity. By this point, Jim Jones had become heavily addicted to substances, and they were altering the way he spoke, the way he moved, and everything that he did in his day-to-day life. And that's why Yolanda one day seizes the opportunity when she finds Jim particularly incapacitated, and she actually mentally manipulates Jim like he has been for all these years. She convinces Jim that the horror stories of Jonestown would be a thing of the past if he was seen to do some good, and that could start with letting Yolanda go when she requested. She swore that she would leave Jonestown, and not only would she not speak a bad word about it, she would say nothing but good about the settlement, therefore casting doubt on Deborah Layton's claims. And eventually, Yolanda leaves, but she keeps it a secret. She doesn't go to any authorities for 10 years to tell them the truth. And overall, there were another 8 people that left during that time in Guyana. Tim and Grace Stowen, Stephen Anthony Kataris, and Jim Cobb were some of the others that formed a group called Concerned Relatives. And this group both urged and fought the US government for quite a while to go and investigate Jonestown. And that meant that by November of that year, Congressman Leo Ryan was ready to take a look at Jonestown.
So the pressure was so intense that the US government had to do something, and that is where Leo Ryan comes into this story. He was a congressman from the San Francisco Bay Area. This was the area in which the HQ of the People's Temple was located. And yes, that was one connection, but also Leo Ryan had another connection which was far closer to home. Ryan had a friend called Sammy Houston, who unfortunately at this time was suffering with severe illness. Sammy had a son called Bob, and he died on October the 5th, 1976. Bob was part of Jim Jones's inner circle until he defected. And soon after he defected, in fact, days after he defected, he was found dead at his place of work, which was a railway yard. He was found pretty much crushed by a train. And when people found him in that place of work, people that knew him, they discovered that he didn't have his trademark gloves on. Basically, Bob would never go to work and he would never be seen anywhere near the railway yard without his gloves. That was because in his spare time, he was a musician. He cared very much about the safety and state of his hands, and he would never want any injuries to impact his musical career. And the death was initially described as a workplace incident and was never thought to be suspicious at all. But people close to Bob knew that that simply wasn't the case, and they linked it and they thought that Jim Jones was responsible. So Leo Ryan decided that he had to get involved in this case, and he had a record of doing so. He was known as a bulldog, and he even once went undercover inside a prison to understand what the conditions of the place were actually like. And because he was the chair of a US House subcommittee, he was able to take on the Guyana issue. Obviously, going into someone else's land in a foreign territory would often be very, very difficult for the US government. But because US citizens were involved in this, Leo Ryan had carte blanche. He was able to go and investigate things for himself. On the 1st of November 1978, Leo Ryan wrote directly to Jim Jones saying that he had received numerous requests from the relatives of people inside of Jonestown, and he said that he was going to visit Guyana and Jonestown specifically himself to understand and satisfy his constituents' concerns. He then sent that letter to Jim Jones, and Jim Jones took his time. When he replied through his lawyers, and he tried to dissuade Ryan from coming anywhere near Jonestown. And also, he went to the government of Guyana and asked them not to allow him inside the country, let alone Jonestown itself. The lawyers even said that this letter was a form of harassment, but Leo Ryan didn't give up. He wrote back and he said that he wanted to deal with Jones directly, not just his attorneys. And as you can imagine, Jim Jones, dealing with substances, as Joey has said, very paranoid in the way that he has been for most of his life, was terrified of what this visit might actually bring to Jonestown and his life. And he started manipulating people of Jonestown in the only way he knew how. He convinced people and forced them to sign affidavits and write letters saying that they were absolutely fine and that there was nothing wrong in Jonestown. But Leo Ryan wouldn't give up, and so he negotiated with Jones about who could attend, how many people, if journalists were welcome to, and this went on for days and days and days. But finally he was able to charter a plane and fly into Jonestown with 18 people, including an NBC cameraman, producers working for that station, and a San Francisco Examiner reporter called Tim Reiterman, as well as several concerned relatives. But what I should say is that many more relatives wanting to attend, but Jim Jones only allowed 4 of the relevant relatives into Jonestown. But finally, they were allowed in. They flew into Jonestown. They actually circled the location and were able to look at the town itself from the sky. And they realized this wasn't just a small community in the middle of the jungle. This was a fully established, massive town, harboring over 1,000 people. And when they arrive, the greeting is choreographed. The smiling residents lie under the entrance with a welcome sign, and brass bands was playing and children were waving flags. And interestingly for us, all of this is on camera. And from the pavilion, Jones's voice can be heard. It's beaming over a huge loudspeaker system that is ringing out across the entire community. And he gives a rambling, exhaustive speech about how people are completely fine and everyone is happy inside the town. Ryan then goes through various different locations, including the dorms, the cottages where people lived, and he saw bunk beds. Occasionally there were only 2, but in reality, Jim Jones had packed these cottages made for 4 or 5 people with up to 20 people. Living conditions had got worse and worse, and people that were often at the start, when I said that there were only 40 or 50 people there, they were eating well, but now that wasn't the case. They were living on rice and tin goods, and they were ill and they had rashes and they had worms and they were increasingly unwell. But whenever these types of visits happened, Jim Jones would provide more medical care. He would look after people that were looking malnourished and give them extra food so that they were supposedly fit and ready for their visit. But as Leo Ryan enters different parts of the commune, he actually saw a suspiciously armed security building. So initially it feels like a remote hippie community, but there are things that don't feel right as well. So they continue the tour. Everything seems normal. Leo Ryan gets into basically this communal area, the pavilion, in which people have their dinners and sit down for a meal. He conducts a rousing speech in which he says that everyone that he spoke to so far seems like they're getting on incredibly well. Everyone seems healthy and everyone seems to love Jonestown. And it seems like the utopia that Jim Jones says it is. When he finishes his speech, the crowds give him a rousing, upstanding ovation. They cheer and everything seems happy. But then Ryan is slipped a note. The message reads, "Dear Congressman, please help us get out of Jonestown." The following morning, the reality of the commune's oppressive environment becomes undeniable. As Ryan and his staff conduct interviews, a family of 7, led by Edith Parks, marched up to them and declared their desire to leave. Jim Jones pleaded with the defectors, offering them up to $5,000 and their passports to stay, but they refused. Ultimately, around 15 residents gathered their belongings to escape with the congressman. So as you can imagine, Leo Ryan is now taking these 15 people and he's going to the airstrip to try and get them to escape. He is incredibly nervous, as you would be. He sees that there's now a real threat and there's definitely something going on. And so they're now waiting for these 2 planes to come and pick them up. They realize that the 2 planes are not big enough to have all of the 15 defectors and all of the 18 people that were with the congressman. So they actually have to now go and decide who's going to go in the 2 planes and who's going to wait. And as they do, tension is building and building, right? It's getting scarier and scarier. And stuff starts to happen pretty quickly from there. And this is when something very scary happens. There's a man called Don Sly, who is a fanatical Jim Jones devotee. And what he does is he pulls out a knife and goes to attack the congressman. They start and they get into a fight, but unimaginably, the congressman survives, and it's actually only Don that suffers injuries. The attack convinces Ryan that they are in immense and extreme danger and that they need to leave right now. So they start boarding the planes. And as we've said, this is all on camera. Among the people waiting to get onto those planes is a man called Larry Layton, a fanatical Jones loyalist who had feigned a desire to leave.
And you might remember that name. Larry Layton was the brother of Deborah Layton, who had already defected, and Larry had obviously condemned his sister. So just how real Larry's desire to leave was, it's probably open to interpretation.
And as the first plane prepared to take off, Layton pulled out a concealed .38 revolver and opened fire inside the cabin, wounding 2 people before being disarmed. And then everything kicks off. Simultaneously, a red tractor pulling a trailer sped onto the airstrip and stopped near the 2 planes. 6 armed temple guards leapt from the trailer and fired indiscriminately into the crowd. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot more than 20 times and killed. 4 others were also murdered on the tarmac, including NBC reporter Don Harris, the cameraman Bob Brown, the photographer Greg Robinson, and the defector Patricia Parks. Several others were gravely wounded but survived by fleeing into the jungle and pretending to be dead. During this, Jim Jones is getting reports of what's going on, and he commits to the final white knight. This isn't a test anymore. This isn't to see how people are devoted. This is reality, and there's nothing fake about this potential threat.
And it really does show you just how calculated and just how purposeful the White Knights actually were. Because although Jim Jones may have played them off as something that wasn't that important, this literally solidifies the theories that those White Knights were trial runs.
And this is exactly what they were. Jones incites total panic at this time, lying to his congregation, claiming that the Guyanese Defense Force and hostile mercenaries would soon parachute in, invade the camp, and torture the children of the community. A large steel drum was brought to the front of the pavilion, and it was filled with that same great flavored drink that every single White Knight had seen. But this time, it was different. It had a lethal combination of potassium cyanide, Valium, and other substances that would murder the Jonestown community. And as Jim Jones's voice blares out across the community through the speakers and also through the pavilion itself, Jones commanded his followers to drink the poison, framing it as a revolutionary to protest the cruelty of the capitalist world. Now, was it indeed a self-deletion? Were people doing this willingly? Well, the fact that there were 25 armed guards stood with guns waiting for people to commit this and actually drink the drink indicates that it wasn't necessarily a self-deletion.
You literally don't need any indication at all in this case. And I know that you know that already yourself. There were 300 or more, actually, more than 300 children that died as part of that final White Knight. Children don't make the decisions in those sort of cases, in my opinion. So at absolute worst, you murdered 300 people. And we all know that the real number is way, way higher.
Yeah, 100%. And right, before we get into this detail now of going through what actually happened to the Jonestown community members, I just want to say this is absolutely devastatingly awful. So just prepare yourself for that.
And that meant in a short space of time, pretty much one by one, every single person there drank the poison.
And many of them did not do so voluntarily. Very often people were actually forced to drink the substance and ingest that poison. All in all, over 918 people died, including, as Joey says, over 300 children. And Jim Jones, after leading all of his flock and all of his congregation to complete this, what he described as a revolutionary act. He didn't even have the guts to drink the drink himself. He was actually found with a gunshot wound, a single gunshot wound, and that's how he decided to take his own life.
So why do you think it is that in 2026, there's still so much debate, confusion, and ultimately disagreement over the fates and outcomes of those people? And what I mean by that is there's a lot of people that believe that this was a mass delete rather than murder.
Yeah, this isn't an act of self-deletion. The way that these people were basically conducted and forced and actually had to deal with so much trauma throughout this entire case. We've spoken about the beatings. We've spoken about the mental trauma. We've spoken about the white knights. There was so much manipulation leading up to this moment. I don't think any sane person can say that this is self-deletion.
Well, it's like, for example, me, because where they're captivated by him and where they're engrossed by everything he's told them, it's like me being a doctor that people believe and people trust, me telling someone that they're terminally ill, and then if something then happens to that person, if they were to take their own life or something like that, if it wasn't true, it's like me saying, well, I had no involvement. No, you did. You did. You shaped the way they think, and therefore you had a huge involvement. What me and you know is that's not necessarily the case. I'm saying that they could have been so brainwashed almost by Jim Jones that they thought that that was the right thing. But there's multiple accounts of people being forced to take that poison on that day. And therefore, I do think that we are looking at the biggest killer in US history when we talk about Jim Jones. Let me know your thoughts on how those people met their faith and what you determine the method to be. And most importantly, people, let us know what you would like to see in the comment section below. We have had the Jonestown video requested to us by members quite a few times now, and therefore we had to take a deep dive. Condolences go to everyone that was affected by the events that we spoke about in this episode. We will see you all in the next one.